Well, now, look, this is our last program for the week. We'll be back next week, of course, but let's conclude our interviews on a clarifying note. Remember, earlier this week I mentioned the European Commission releasing a set of guidelines in October of the kind of language that should and should not be used in a multicultural Europe. And amongst all the rubbish was the blinding stupidity that you couldn't refer to ladies and gentlemen. You couldn't describe people as being married or single because that would make cohabiting people invisible. You couldn't use the word citizen, that would exclude immigrants. And words like colonisation and settlement have negative connotations. So instead of talking about the colonisation of Mars, you'd have to talk about sending people to Mars. This is the European Union. Are we very far behind, or are we in step with this nonsense? I've been asking, haven't I, is the Australia today, where this stuff goes on here, the kind of Australia we want it to be? Let me pose this question to a man who has written with great clarity on these issues many times, though his head must be bruised from banging it many times up against the proverbial brick wall. But as you know, this is a battle that must be won. The how and the when are critical. Nick Cater is the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. He writes splendidly for the Australian newspaper, and he joins me. Nick, thank you for your time. The stupidity of the EU Commission for Equality is obvious to the majority, but nonetheless, it is at work here in Australia, isn't it? I mean, the ladies and gentlemen, you can't be described as married or single, you can't be described as a citizen, you can't use the word Christmas. And this is happening here. What evidence is there in the streets and in the shops right now of the spirit of Christmas and the celebration of this important Christian festival?
Well, I mean, I came through Wynyard Station this morning, Alan, and there was a lovely silver band. I think it's a railway band there playing some great Christmas carols. And I tell you what, people were standing around with smiles on their faces.
Yes.
So I think people who actually go out and do work for a living instead of sitting there behind their laptops, they're enjoying Christmas, and they've got no problem with Christmas. They love all the traditions about it, the Christian tradition, of course, on which it's based, and all the things that have happened since. They don't want to do away with it. It's people that spend too much time on Twitter, I think. That
absolutely. Nick, it must be crook, though, when even the most woke pope of all time sensed the attempt to erase Christianity, which is the foundation of Western civilization. Not too many people prepared today to stand up and defend it.
Well, no, but I was very pleased to see the Pope did, and others, and other leaders, you know, Daniel Macron and others in Europe were prepared to stand up and say, look, this Christianity is part of our heritage. And people like Macron not afraid to say that. I worry in this country, though, whether we're as vigilant over our Christian heritage. And we need to be, because there's so much that comes from it, of course, not just Christmas, but...
Nick, that's one of the reasons we're talking to you, and we'll continue to talk to you. See, in many ways, Nick, we're standing the world on its head. We've had this case in America of Jussie Smollett, a gay black actor who alleged he'd been lynched by racist, homophobic Trump supporters. It turns out he had paid 2 Nigerian immigrants to stage a white supremacist attack. But Joe Biden tweeted, quote, "We're with you, Jussie," and blamed all of this on homophobia and racism. Kamala Harris called it a modern-day lynching. Nick, what is going on here?
Well, people are so quick to jump on stories that fit their narrative. And the police, as I gather, in Chicago were very suspicious from the start, because Justin Smollett emerged from this apparent melee clutching a Subway sandwich completely intact. And they said, well, that just doesn't happen. I mean, if somebody's been attempted lynching and he's been roughed up in the street, they don't stand up with a Subway sandwich in their hands. But the woke, if you like, the woke president, the woke vice president, and the woke media jump on this. They want stories to justify their belief that America is inherently racist, that it's full of racist people, and that its history is somehow shameful. And anything that runs that narrative, they'll jump on with the slightest evidence that this turned out to be completely false. You know, Smollett committed a hate crime on himself.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we oppose homophobia and racism. That's as obvious as the nose on your face. But a person faking both for whatever reason is hardly worthy of the woke response that occurred. I mean, is this a manifestation of the rules changing and the attempt to establish new norms?
Yeah, it is, Alan. I'll tell you what, it's heartening in one sense. I mean, if you have to actually fake a white supremacist attack on yourself, then it shows that there isn't too much of it around, not as much certainly as the media makes out, you know.
Right.
And it couldn't even get any white supremacists. You had to get two immigrants from Nigeria to play their parts.
Very
you know,
good
the whole
point.
thing is ludicrous.
Very good point. But nonetheless, this stuff from the European Commission is gaining traction rather than condemnation, because clearly the woke world is a minority, but the minority seeks to assume the influence of the majority. What do you do about this?
Well, they do. They want to set these rules. And we did some polling earlier this year and asked people, do you think that political correctness is basically out of control? 4 out of 5 Australians say yes. Even a majority of Green supporters say yes. So that's the view of the vast majority of people. But it just, I think what it shows, Alan, is this ruling class.
Just to interrupt you there, Nick. Nick refers to this. I'll just give you those details because we're not expecting Nick to commit this to memory. But the polling asked whether too much of our Australian way of life is being sacrificed to political correctness. Now, 77% of Australians agreed. 87% of coalition voters, 70% of Labor voters agreed, and even 48% of the Greens. So why, Nick, Nick, to use your words, does the woke corporate world yield to, your words, the cacophony on Twitter rather than understand the voices of the real people? Because the corporate world's worst of anybody.
They are. This is where I think that they're in there to make business, right? And they're going and changing the names of products, perfectly good products like Coon cheese or Redskins, those little chewy red sweets we used to have, because they're politically incorrect. But when you ask ordinary people, they don't want those names changed.
Correct.
And it seems to me that whoever they're listening to, they're not listening to their customers. The corporate boardrooms are just in a bubble right now, Alan. They're just out of touch with the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And nowhere more so than the so-called debate, where there is no debate at all, on climate change. Now, as you've said, this is driven by sentiment, not science. When carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the atmosphere, what are we on about with decarbonisation? We're an energy superpower. Why are we playing this game?
We've got caught up in a whole international clown show on this, Alan, and it's been going on, as you know, for 30 years or more.
Yeah.
This idea that that the world can act together to reduce carbon emissions, because but once these processes start, of course, it's very hard to stop them. They take a life of their own, and unfortunately, I think Australia, like other countries, is just caught up in this. It's very, very difficult, as you know. I mean, you've been doing it longer and harder than most to actually make any traction when you speak out against it, because it is, in the end, like a faith, really. People believe this on faith as much as anything.
It's a cult. I mean, it's totally emotional. I mean, how could, seriously, someone cheering Greta Thunberg, for goodness sake? I thought you wrote brilliantly when you talked about this whole issue and the strategy to, quote, these are Nick's words, to scare the population witless about a common enemy that only the state has the power to fight. And you call it the oldest, most ignoble trick in the political playbook. But you further say, Nick, I have to say, especially for Australia, quote, balancing benefits with costs is all but impossible in an atmosphere of catastrophe. And of course, we've learnt that with the pandemic, didn't we, Nick?
Well, that's exhibit number one on this, Alan. All the talk about benefits, many of which haven't happened, incidentally. I think we were sort of over-promised on the vaccines. They haven't turned out to be quite as effective as they hoped. But everything was promised, but nobody looked at the cost, and the cost is horrendous. Not just the cost in money, that's big enough, but the cost in human lives and human dignity. You know the stories. People talk to you a lot about this. People talk to me, Alan. People are doing it, are having miserable lives because of what the government's done. Businesses that have fallen over and won't be coming back, and nobody who's involved with setting these rules that kill these businesses off have any idea what's happening, because they basically don't get away from their laptops.
No, I keep saying they've never filled out a payroll tax slip. You take Daniel Andrews of Victoria, declared a state of emergency in March. The state faced the biggest lockdown in the world, and Daniel Andrews said he'd flatten the curve of COVID-19. So everyone suffered. Today, 1,622 cases as I speak to you. The curve's not flattened, but the suffering has been almost inhuman. The public have been flattened.
That's right. No logic to this, right? So he closes down the state, I think in July, wasn't it, or late July, on the basis of, I think, 16 cases. And now there's, well over 1,000 a day, and he thinks it's okay to open up. Please tell me, what health advice is he acting on? Is he acting on any advice?
That's right. We almost need a Royal Commission. You're dead right. Where is the advice? I said over and over again, give us a slip of paper that tells us what the advice is. But now Daniel Andrews has extended power to himself. So the state of emergency, he has the power to extend it if he wants for another 15 months. So through the Parliament, and I wonder whether Victorians know this via a couple of unknown people in the upper house, Daniel Andrews has the right to declare a pandemic at any time without a single case of a specific disease in the state. Hey, is this North Korea?
Oh, what's happening there is just atrocious, and it's not being reported largely, Alan. I mean, doctors' surgeries are being raided by parking inspectors, would you believe, who are given special powers. They're made authorised officers to raid doctors' surgeries to get personal patient information. This is when they think doctors are giving away too many exemptions. This is wrong on so many levels. And I think what frustrates me more than anything is you just don't hear this spoken about.
No.
Hardly spoken about at all.
And we know why. We know why, Nick, because, and you and I are in this league, the critics of this disproportionate response are condemned and vilified and indeed cancelled. So what happens when the solution fails to fix the problem? And then don't you like the bit the government claims, oh, hang on, it would have been a lot worse if not for our prudent programs. They were never proven answers, were they?
No. And can I just say, just to go off track a bit, this is a benefit of what you're doing right now, Alan. You're doing this as an independent presenter with a lot of support behind you. And we can have these frank conversations in a way that's very hard if you're attached to a mainstream media company.
Yes. I mean, the freedoms that were taken away from us was nothing more than a human experiment. What do you think is the correlation, Nick, between this centralised, coercive government and incompetence? I mean, you say, quote, the Andrews government serves as a living example of why governments that rule by fiat are more prone to failure than those forced to run the gauntlet of Parliament. Decision-making is restricted to a handful of individuals who lack perfect knowledge and are vulnerable to groupthink. You say contrary facts, discordant data and alternative strategies are suppressed. Since all power emanates from the Emperor, no one in his inner circle is going to tell him he has no clothes. Increased power, you wrote, leads to an excess of hubris. Any reserves of humility the leader might have are depleted as the God complex begins to set in. Listen, we've got to get rid of this stuff, Nick. We've got to get rid of this stuff. This is not the way a democratic society functions.
No, it's not democratic, but it's not good government because it's common sense, right? And I know here at the Menzies Research Centre, I might come up with a bright idea in the shower in the morning, but that idea is almost always improved when I share it with the team here. And you share it even more widely and it gets even better and you knock off any dangerous edges to it. That's the problem when you're just making very important decisions about the economy, about people's lives from within the Premier's office with probably just a handful of people in the room. That's why it's bad government, and that's why, awkward as Daniel Andrews finds Parliament, that's what he's got Parliament for. That's what people elected their parliamentary representatives for, and he should be using them. Okay. And why Parliament was able to sort of surrender these powers to him, I mean, what do they want to do? They not want to do their job? OK, just finally, before you go then, answer my question that I posed in the first program. Is this the Australia that we would like it to be? Certainly not, Alan. I happen to believe that Australia is a self-correcting country and it gets better all the time, but that doesn't mean to say it doesn't go through some terrible patches. And we're in one of those now. We've got to learn from what's happened in the last 2 years in COVID. We've got to and correct all the imbalances and get our freedoms back.
Good on you. Wonderful stuff. There he is. Great to talk, Nick, and we're going to talk to you
Thanks,
again
Alan.
as well. Happy Christmas to you and the family as well.
And to you.
Not at all. That's Nick Cater, the CEO of the Menzies Research Centre. Now, you can go to, the website, alanjones.com.au. It's all there, and you can hear Nick on the podcast tomorrow morning as well, and you can make some comments. What are your thoughts? You've heard what he said, is this the Australia that we want Australia to be?